This talk from Ralph Blumenthal was delivered in December of 2022 in New York City at an Inquiry into Anomalous Experiences and the Phenomenon. We've recently announced the next conference event in this series, which will be happening on Saturday, April 8th, 2023 in New York City and online. We'll be joined by Leslie Kane, Ryan Graves, Derek Pitts, James Fox, Elizabeth Crone, Peter Lavenda, and Dr. Daniel Ingram. Hosted by Leslie Kane, James Iandoli, and me, J. Christopher King. Tickets to join us live or online are now available at aninquiry2023.rsvpfi.com, but they're going fast. That link is down in the show notes and also in the comments. We're looking forward to the upcoming conference, and we hope to see you there. If you like this video, you can subscribe to our channel for more great content in the days ahead. And now, we bring you Kelly Chase and Ralph Blumenthal.
Hi, everyone. First of all, I want to thank all of you for being here today. I believe that what we're doing here is of critical importance. By coming together to form a community and a coalition around a more sober academic approach to the phenomenon, we are carving out an essential space for the exploration of realities that our current cultural paradigm has become blind to. And I'd especially like to thank our speakers for being here and lending their voices, their expertise, and for being willing to step into the fray on a topic that is often met with snickers and derision. Thank you for everything that you have done and continue to do to move this topic forward. And what I find most remarkable about this gathering today is that each of these speakers represents the best and brightest of their respective fields. And although they come from a variety of different backgrounds, and although each of them approaches the phenomenon from a different angle, each of them have come here to say some version of the same thing, which is this: something significant about the nature of our reality is not as we have been told. And perhaps we shouldn't be surprised. It's been 100 years since we discovered quantum mechanics and the baffling reality that the mere act of observing an event can change its outcome. We have decades of hard data telling us that psi phenomena, ranging from precognition to telepathy, isn't just real, but it appears to be a latent ability that most people have, at least to some degree. And over the last 5 years, we have whistleblowers at the highest levels of our government stepping forward to say that UFOs are real and that they exhibit a level of technology that breaks every paradigm that we have. It's no wonder the consensus reality is fraying at the edges. How many impossible things need to be proven true for us to be willing to humble ourselves and admit that the frameworks that we use to assess what is possible and what is not might be fundamentally flawed in some way that we haven't yet considered? The problem is that our modern world does not equip people to grapple with those things that lie outside of the realm of our current understanding. Ontologically speaking, the last couple of centuries have been defined by a long, slow slide down a slippery slope that started with a very reasonable and rational idea that science should concern itself primarily with what can be measured, to the absurd and epistemologically crippling idea that anything that can't be measured can be said, definitively and scientifically, to not exist. We as a species find ourselves in quite a pickle. Entire swaths of the human experience, and seemingly critical ones at that, have been deemed to be impossible. And so where does that leave us when impossible things happen? For many of us, it leaves us trapped in a postmodern hellscape where we can't trust ourselves. We can't trust others. We can't even trust the eyewitness accounts of top Navy pilots, even when those accounts are verified by multiple weapon systems on the most advanced aircraft carriers in the world. So where does one find a logical foothold in such a place? What can be known when no one can be trusted to accurately perceive, much less report, their experience? The fear among the skeptics seems to be that what we're calling for is a complete abandonment of reason. But what we're advocating for isn't the death of reason, but rather for the resurrection and reintegration of meaning. We're asking for the development of new paradigms that acknowledge and make space for the fullness of human experience. And instead of conveniently relegating what we can't explain to the realm of non-existence, we're advocating for a sober, rigorous, and scientific exploration of the impossible things that somehow keep happening. And what could be more reasonable than that? And our next speaker has fearlessly been leading the charge for greater transparency and deeper understanding around the UFO and related phenomena. Award-winning journalist Ralph Blumenthal was a staff reporter at the New York Times from 1964 to 2009. He led the Times Metro team that won the Pulitzer Prize for breaking news coverage of the 1993 truck bombing at the World Trade Center. And in 2017, he was part of the team, along with another of our esteemed speakers, Leslie Kean, that broke the story in the New York Times about the Pentagon's secret UFO program. He is the author of several books, including The Believer, Alien Encounters, Hard Science, and The Passion of John Mack. In short, we're very lucky to have him. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Ralph Blumenthal to the stage.
Thanks, Kelly. Thanks, Jay, for inviting me. Thanks to fellow panelists and all of you for coming out, everybody online. Here's a rare photo of John Mack and Leslie Kean with aliens. Unretouched photo. Pictures don't lie. At the Laughlin, Nevada UFO conference in 2002. And this what this proves indubitably, of course, is that John Mack had a sense of humor. He also collected UFO cartoons. Now, John Mack, of course, is the Harvard psychiatrist who risked his eminent career to investigate alien abduction and a whole series of anomalies, including life after death. And I'm sure John needs no introduction here. Now, my book, The Believer, is the story of John Mack and his struggles with Harvard to get the truth out. By the way, I will explain at the end that I don't use the term the believer pejoratively. I'll explain why. And finally, shamelessly self-promoting, this is my next book with my wife. It's a children's picture book, a nonfiction, strictly factual, on UFOs, coming out in April by a wonderful illustrator. Thank you. It's available for pre-order, actually. It's the end of the self-promotion. Okay, and the end of the slides, thankfully. Okay, so I'm calling this little talk The Abduction of John Mack, a hero's journey into the heart of cosmic darkness. Now, abduction in this telling is in quotes because it's metaphorical. John, as you probably know, was never abducted or even ever saw a UFO, and neither, by the way, have I. And John Mack came to reflect that this was probably all to the good because it left him pure to conduct his research without any bias. And I could say the same thing, actually. Now, John was struck by this phenomenon, and as he told a reporter for Psychology Today, of course, he was struck by it. It remains the most fascinating puzzle in the cosmos. So I got inspiration for my talk from a statement I use as the epigram of my book, and you'll probably recognize his name from Jeff's talk, Sir William Crookes, a renowned English scientist of the 1870s in England, who was sent by skeptical fellow scientists to debunk all kinds of anomalous things that were going on, including levitation and weird things that they couldn't explain. And Crookes witnessed these things and came away a believer. He was astounded at what he had seen, and people levitating, musical instruments playing themselves in a locked cabinet. And he said afterwards, I never said it was possible. I only said it was true. And I love that. And I take it really as a kind of a shorthand for the field we're discussing today. Impossible yet true. We're up against a great mystery. It was not solved by John Mack or anyone else I know of. As the renowned chronicler of anomalies, Charles Fort, said, it's like looking for a needle no one ever lost in a haystack that never was. to give you some idea of what we're up against. And also, Jeff mentioned Jacques Vallée, who described himself as the only ufologist who doesn't know what UFOs are. And I'm with him. So we have to maintain our humility. But at least the Pentagon now admits that these things are real. They're physical objects that might threaten our military and civilian aircraft with near misses. And that's about all we know so far. But it's progress from the days when the government, of course, denied the existence of these altogether and described them as fly specks on the windshield or swamp gas, infamously hallucinogenic, non-reality things. But the phenomenon remains as mysterious as death, as Whitley knows. And you'll hear more about that also from my colleague, Leslie. So John Mack's death is sort of where my story begins. In 2004, I was the New York Times correspondent in Texas when I happened to pick up a used book called A Passport to the Cosmos. Now, this was John Mack's second book, more careful and altogether better, as he himself said, than his first book, Abduction, Human Encounters with Aliens, which was a little too breathless and a little too credulous. And it got him into trouble with Harvard, as I'll get to. Anyway, I read Passport in 2004, and I was frankly blown away. Thought it was extraordinary that there was a Harvard psychiatrist who clearly believed in the reality of UFOs and alien beings based on what people he was treating or talking to was telling him. And I thought he'd make a great story for the Times. And I had no idea, by the way, that he was already so famous. He'd already been in the Times, written up many times, and he'd been on Oprah. He'd been on a lot of TV shows, but something I didn't know at all. And I thought very naively, I'd give him a call and set up an interview. I picked up the paper a few days later to see he'd been run over and killed in London. He'd gone to celebrate the 30th anniversary of his Pulitzer Prize-winning biography of Lawrence of Arabia. And like many Americans, he got out of the underground station at night, looked the wrong way, like many Yanks do in London, and got run over by a drunk driver. Now, when I got over my shock, I reached out to his family, I tracked them down, and asked whether I could get his archives, access to his archives. And eventually, after a period of grieving, they agreed. And I did get access to his vast and voluminous archive, including private journals, which he kept, unpublished manuscripts, patient accounts, and recordings of his own therapy sessions, because as a psychiatrist, he had to be analyzed himself. And he, great saver that he was, he recorded these with a guru. And they fell into my possession as well. So John, I found, was an unlikely pursuer of the weird anomalies he stumbled across, as was I. I mean, I grew up reading science fiction, as many young people did in days after the war, and Ray Bradbury, Isaac Asimov, Arthur C. Clarke, the great masters. But then I decided to study art and journalism, and went on to a career at the New York Times, where I covered Nazi war criminals and corrupt politicians. Maybe that's a tautology. Nothing to do with UFOs and aliens, until I stumbled across John Mack's Passport to the Cosmos. So by 2010, I had retired from the Times staff. I was working on my book on John when I took a summer job teaching journalism to international high school students at Phillips Exeter Academy in Exeter, New Hampshire. Now, Exeter, you probably all know, is a sainted place in UFO history, ground zero of the celebrated 1965 incident at Exeter. And I traced that story in my book, going back to the backdrop when pilot Ken Arnold spotted so-called flying saucers over Mount Washington, back in 1947 and followed very quickly by the crash of something at Roswell. First, the military called it a flying disc, famously. Then it was a balloon, a weather balloon, but a flurry of other sightings followed and studied by the Air Force, which then covered up its investigations with lies and misinformation. Then in 1965, a fellow named John Grant Fuller, a Broadway playwright and columnist for the Saturday Review, learned of the incident at Exeter. Norman Muscarello, an 18-year-old kid, had seen these UFOs hitchhiking home on Route 150 one night, and was a route, by the way, that I had come to know very well outside Exeter because I rode my bike there, and there's high-tension wires where these UFOs were flocking around. So two policemen who were summoned by Norman Muscarello's story then saw these UFOs, and so did lots of other witnesses. And Fuller then learned of the story of Betty and Barney Hill, who had a very strange abduction encounter in the White Mountains of New Hampshire. And the story didn't break until the encounter happened in 1961, but the story didn't break really until 1965. And John Grant Fuller put them both out, the incident at Exeter and the Betty and Barney Hill Interrupted Journey, as a book in 1965, and that made history. Now, John Mack didn't care about any of this because back then he was studying T.E. Lawrence and working on his psychiatry at Harvard and doing various very good social projects, bringing social services and mental health services to underserved areas around Boston, and he couldn't care less about UFOs. So my book takes up the story really starting in 1990, when John Mack learned of the encounters from Bud Hopkins, and with his expertise as a psychiatrist, soon ruled out all the facile explanations that were being given for these experiences. They were not, he quickly determined from his endpoint as a prize-winning psychiatrist, they were not hallucinations, they were not mental illness, they were certainly not fabrications and hoaxes. The people were too upset in the recounting of these to be made up, he quickly determined. And unless 2-year-old kids, for example, could make up stories based on the books they had read and the films they'd seen, John decided that these were, whatever the reality of these experiences were, they were not deliberate fabrications. Now, as I said, John Mack didn't start off interested in UFOs and aliens. His father, Edward Mack, was a well-known English professor at City College of New York, where I was a student back when he was a professor there. I didn't know who he was. I knew his name, but it's really one of the many interesting synchronicities I came across in writing my book. On his father's side, John descended from a pioneering ophthalmologist and noted cancer specialist and one of the first Jewish academicians at Harvard. On his mother's side, he came from a family of German brewers who developed Rheingold beer. And growing up, I used to look at the posters of the election for Miss Rheingold and all these gorgeous young women and wished I was old enough to vote, among other things. And you know, I started coming across all these synchronicities. Interestingly enough, I was searching as I was writing my book for a cousin of John Mack's, who was the last brewer of Rheingold, a man named Terry Liebman. Liebman being the family name of the Rheingold brewers. I looked all over for him, and I finally found him living across the street from me in Manhattan. It was just a number of very strange things. So John Mack came from a wealthy family. His father's mother had inherited millions, and his father, Edward Mack, grew up in what became the opulent Sherry Netherland on Central Park. And Edward Mack attended Exeter's sister school, Andover, and married Eleanor Liebman of the Rheingold brewing family, and she gave birth to John Mack in in September 1929, just as the stock market crash was triggering the Great Depression. Not that it really hurt the family much because they somehow had enough outside investments, so they came through pretty much all right. But Eleanor died of appendicitis at 25, John's mother, when John was just 8.5 months. And penicillin had just been discovered or developed, but was not yet in common use, so it didn't help her. And that became a very important part of the story, I found, because John was always searching for his birth mother. He always felt he'd been separated from this vital force in his life, and that perhaps explains some of his search for the missing in the cosmos. And that's just not my analysis, but his own. He realized that as a psychiatrist. And he was, in fact, tormented by his mother's death all his life, as he repeatedly told his therapist in the notes that I got and the recordings. And thank God he was a good saver. Now, after Eleanor's death, John Mack's father remarried. He remarried another socialite. You could analyze that a bit, I suppose. Her name was Ruth Prince Gimbel. She was the widow of a great-grandson of the founder of the Gimbel's department store chain. And as the Great Depression hit or worsened in 1930, Adam Gimbel jumped out of a window at the Yale Club near Grand Central. And the distraught widow, Ruth Gimbel, soon met the grieving widower, Edward Mack, and suddenly they were married, and John Mack had a stepmother. And since Ruth had a daughter a little older than baby John, he had a stepsister as well. Again, this went into his psychological development and gave him a lot to work with, shall we say. And I had another interesting synchronicity in the course of my research because I was working, and I'm still working at Baruch College in the archives, and I came across a set of Ruth Mack's papers. She was a well-known New Deal economist, and somehow a batch of her papers, a file turned up at Baruch College where I was archiving all these files. So the Mack story sort of kept following me. So John Mack, very charismatic, cobalt-eyed, devilishly handsome, as well as confident, impetuous, and intellectually brilliant, grew up in this conventional, secular German-Jewish household. It was not a spiritual family at all. He remembers growing up listening to his father read the Bible, but it was as literature, not as the literal word of God. And he grew up with a strong social conscience. He developed mental health services for the poor in Cambridge, which was then a very downtrodden part of Boston. And one night, like many of us, he went to the movies to see this new, long, sensational movie called Lawrence of Arabia. He went with his wife, Sally, who was then pregnant with their first boy. And we all went to see the movie, or many of us, and came out saying, wow, it was a long movie, but it was a great movie. Won all kinds of prizes later. But John Mack came out determined to investigate the story of T.E. Lawrence. And Lawrence being a very enigmatic personality who fomented the Arab revolt against the Ottoman Turks. And John Mack thought he made a fascinating psychological study, which he did.